Welcome back to planet Shmearth, where evolution continues to move slower than a tectonic plate on tranquilizers, and the main event is still slime. It is still uncomfortably around 3.5 billion years ago. The Earth is stable in the way a volcano is stable, meaning not at all. The surface is crusty, the oceans a toxic soup, and the atmosphere is that special blend of murder fog and chemical confusion. But despite all this, life persists. Because of course it does. It has nothing better to do. Cyanobacteria are still the planet's most unlikable success story. They're photosynthesizing like they own the place, soaking up sunlight, exhaling oxygen, and blanketing coastlines like smug little patio carpets. They haven't evolved much because they don't need to. They're already winning. Everyone else is adapting just to keep up with the consequences of their oxygen-fueled arrogance. Oxygen continues to leak into the ocean, then into the air, then into everything else it can touch and ruin. It reacts with methane. It rusts the seafloor. It strangles anaerobes like an invisible serial killer. It even begins forming ozone in the upper atmosphere, which is great news for UV protection and terrible news for microbes who enjoyed being microwaved from space. Down in the vents, extremophiles are unfazed. They've been living in complete darkness at 300 degrees Celsius since forever and aren't about to change their lifestyle just because the surface decided to develop an ozone layer. They've got sulfur, they've got pressure, they've got their own problems. In the shallow waters, microbial mats have become the default real estate. Slimy, stratified colonies stack on top of each other in complex, passive-aggressive layers. Oxygen lovers on the top, sulfur eaters on the bottom, confused in-betweeners wedged in the middle like evolutionary sandwich meat. These mats trap sediment, form stromatolites, and occasionally fossilize just to remind the future they were here first. Meanwhile, eukaryotes are getting ideas, still single-celled, still awkward, still bloated with organelles they mostly stole. These ambitious blobs have started experimenting with shape. Some stretch, some spin. Some grow tails and start swimming in circles like they're looking for attention. A few eukaryotes begin absorbing photosynthetic bacteria, not to digest them, but to keep them around like live-in chefs. And so chloroplasts are born, enslaved cyanobacteria, trapped inside a host cell, generating sugar like a biological vending machine with Stockholm syndrome. Photosynthetic eukaryotes spread slowly. They're not fast, they're not efficient, but they're diverse. And on Shmearth, that counts for something. Elsewhere, cells are learning violence. Predation is officially a thing now. One cell engulfs another, digests it, and pretends it was a good idea all along. In response, other cells evolve armor, or slime, or speed. It's a microscopic arms race, minus the arms. The ocean is now layered in complexity. Light at the top, oxygen in the middle, chemical nightmares at the bottom, and in between, chaos. Every niche is a battlefield. Every drop of seawater is a cold war. On land, if you can still call it that, things remain bleak. The continents are barely holding together. Just cracked rafts of rock floating across magma like lazy tectonic bumper cars. Rain falls. Acidic. Unapologetic. Every now and then, a volcano explodes and resets everyone's progress out of spite. Still, the microbes try. Some cyanobacteria creep onto damp coastal rocks. They form mats. They dry out. They die. They do it again. Occasionally, one survives just long enough to leave behind pigment stains and chemical footprints, biofilm graffiti sprayed across ancient stone. This is land colonization, Shmearth style, clumsy, crusty, and 98% failure rate. But life doesn't quit, it just gets weird. The year is now sliding lazily toward 3.45 billion years ago, which, in Earth terms, is the equivalent of blinking slowly in a coma. But down in the ocean, things are heating up in the most passive-aggressive way possible. Microbes, once content to float and absorb whatever molecules drifted into them, are now getting territorial. They excrete chemicals to mark their space. They build protective sheaths. They hoard nutrients. It's like high school, but with less acne and more enzymes. Some start engaging in quorum sensing, a fancy way of saying they detect when there are enough of them nearby to justify doing something stupid together. This is not consciousness. This is biochemical peer pressure. And it works. Suddenly, you've got coordinated behavior, cells swarming, dividing labor, triggering group actions. Welcome to the microbial HOA. In other parts of the water, multicellular behavior is becoming more than a regrettable accident. Colonies of eukaryotes are sticking together after division, not because they forgot to separate, but because they're starting to get something out of the arrangement. One cell does photosynthesis, another handles waste, a third just sits there vibrating with existential dread. It's not a body, it's a committee. But it's a start. Some of these colonial blobs even pass on their structure to the next generation. That's right, this isn't just temporary clustering anymore. It's generational. A lineage of proto-multicellular ambition held together by slime, shared labor, and the sheer inability to admit it's not working. Meanwhile, in the water column, predator cells are evolving strategy. Some develop rudimentary sensors, light, chemicals, the scent of vulnerability. Others grow tails to chase their prey or mucus to slip away from becoming someone else's lunch. Prey cells respond in kind. They develop thicker walls. They secrete toxins. Some just spin rapidly in place like anxious, spiky frisbees. Evolution is not elegant. It is desperate and loud, especially when you're made of one cell and constantly screaming without a mouth. The chemical arms race continues. Toxins get more specific. Enzymes get more targeted. A few cells even start hijacking the communication molecules of their enemies. Microbial misinformation campaigns, basically. At the edges of shallow lagoons, photosynthetic mats now stretch for miles. These aren't isolated patches, they're sprawling kingdoms of slime, layered, dense, competitive, occasionally fossilized just for fun. The mats trap sediments, the sediments form structures, the structures grow into stromatolites, towering lumpy monuments to microbial persistence and architectural disappointment. They look like rocks with commitment issues, they smell like wet compost, and they absolutely dominate the coastlines. If you dropped into this era, somehow immune to boiling water, acid rain, and disappointment, you'd see entire shores lined with these oozing mounds, each one pumping out oxygen like it's trying to ruin everyone's afternoon, which it is. Back in the deep, the vents remain unchanged. The same sulfur, the same heat, the same microbes still living like it's the first Tuesday in history. They don't care about oxygen or climate change or your fancy eukaryotic membranes. They are unchanged and thriving, and deeply uninterested in your progress. The atmosphere, though, is definitely changing. Oxygen has finally reached a point where it's not just annoying, it's impactful. It's reacting with everything. Sulfur, methane, rocks, you. If you were here, you'd rust before you could blink. Methane levels are dropping, which means the planet is losing its greenhouse blanket, and that means, surprise, it's getting colder. Not frozen, Not yet. But moody. Swings in temperature. Icy mornings. Scalding afternoons. The kind of weather that kills weak microbes and forces the rest to mutate just to keep their membranes from cracking like prehistoric cellophane. And then, quietly, awkwardly, eukaryotes invent chloroplasts again. It's a trend now. Cells keep absorbing photosynthetic bacteria and refusing to digest them. The bacteria are trapped inside, pumping out sugar like reluctant interns. And suddenly, the eukaryotes are solar-powered, large, slow, and extremely smug about it. This opens the door to the first truly photosynthetic eukaryotic lineages. They drift through the ocean like bloated jelly beans with ambition, absorbing sunlight and doing absolutely nothing useful with their lives except not dying. By now, 3.4 billion years ago is limping toward 3.35, and the planet has become a full-blown biochemical riot. Every molecule is spoken for. Every niche is occupied. Every drop of water is a turf war. Life has officially gotten too crowded to ignore. Let's talk about the oceans, not the vast open ones. Those are still largely unremarkable, except for being wet, salty, and vaguely hostile. We're talking about the crowded shallows, the microbial suburbs. Here, life is organized like a chaotic multi-level parking garage for cells who all think they have VIP access. At the top layer, the cyanobacteria, obviously, always them. Still photosynthesizing like their chlorophyll has something to prove. They absorb every photon that dares to enter the water and exhale oxygen with the kind of passive-aggressive consistency that ruins ecosystems. Below them are the oxygen-tolerant aerobes, swimming smugly in the wake of the great oxygen dump. Lower still, the anaerobes cling to relevance, huddled in sediments and shadows, avoiding light and oxygen like they're allergic to modernity, which, in a way, they are. They're the ancient aristocracy, now reduced to living in biochemical basements and complaining about how everything used to be simpler. Down at the absolute bottom, the vents, still belching superheated gas and molten regret. And there the extremophiles flourish. Their whole vibe is, if you're not burning alive, are you even trying? They metabolize sulfur, ignore temperature, and judge the rest of the biosphere from their hot, toxic bunkers. Meanwhile, the atmosphere continues its transformation. Oxygen levels creep higher. Ozone starts to form in meaningful amounts. Ultraviolet radiation drops, slightly. And suddenly, shallow water isn't an automatic death sentence anymore. It's still bad, still irradiated, still chemically unstable, but survivable, which is all life needs. A few microbes notice, because microbes notice everything. Some start creeping out of the tide pools, not walking obviously, crawling either, more like oozing. They slime up rocks, they huddle in damp crevices, they form biofilms on land surfaces and pretend it counts as colonization. It doesn't, not yet, but it's the start of something. Barely. Most of these land-dwelling pioneers die within hours. The sun bakes them, the air dries them, the wind scrapes them off like yesterday's mistake. But a few, just enough, manage to survive, divide, and leave behind chemical traces. They stain rocks. They alter minerals. They deposit weird little crusts of organic matter that scream, "Something lived here," briefly, and it was weird. Back in the water, multicellularity is inching forward. Some colonial blobs are now coordinating behaviors. One group of cells absorbs nutrients. Another handles structural support. A third just sort of exists and insists it's part of the team. It's not true multicellularity, but it's getting close. It's not intelligence. It's just accident, piled on accident until something sticks. That's basically the entire business model of evolution. And as these proto-organisms slouch toward coherence, the chemistry around them continues to shift. Nitrogen fixation has now spread across the microbial empire. What was once a rare, risky enzyme is now mainstream. Cells are ripping apart atmospheric nitrogen, converting it into ammonia and pumping it into the biosphere like fertilizer from a molecular meth lab. This, of course, leads to the usual outcome. Everyone else becomes dependent. Life starts relying on fixed nitrogen, the way a bad roommate relies on your Netflix password. No one wants to do the work, but they all want the benefits. And speaking of freeloading, symbiosis is trending again. More and more eukaryotes are turning to endosymbiosis to boost their energy or food production. Swallow a photosynthetic bacterium, get a chloroplast. Swallow a respirator bacterium, get a mitochondrion. Swallow anything else? Well, digestive enzymes are still a thing. Good luck. At this point, the oceans are a museum of cellular strategies. Some microbes grow spikes, some get slippery, some evolve poisons so specific they could be sold as skincare in the 21st century. Others rely on speed, shape, or just pure chemical apathy. The result is a weird, dynamic, and surprisingly violent ecosystem. Still no eyes, still no nervous systems, but enough interactions that you could mistake it for a strategy meeting in a boardroom filled with narcissists and no coffee. And hovering above all of it is the atmosphere, no longer just a mix of volcanic belches and chaos. Now it's starting to organize. Oxygen, nitrogen, trace gases, even carbon dioxide is beginning to fall out of fashion. It's becoming a place where one day real breathing might happen, just not yet. The planet is now flirting with 3.3 billion years ago. Life still has no brain, no spine, no dignity, but it's finally showing signs of ambition. Let's check in on the eukaryotes, those oversized, overcomplicated blobs of self-importance. They've been quietly rehearsing for multicellularity like a community theater production of becoming relevant. And now, they're starting to stick together with intention. Not all of them, just a few trendsetters. These cells aren't just clumping, they're specializing. One group does photosynthesis, one group handles waste, one poor cell in the middle just sits there absorbing everyone else's biochemical drama. This is the dawn of division of labor. Biology's equivalent of someone saying, "What if we didn't all have to do everything badly?" These early cell collectives aren't true multicellular organisms yet, but they're practicing. They reproduce together. They die together. They metabolize in sync like a particularly tragic boy band. They even pass on their group structure to their offspring. Because nothing says progress like a lineage of dysfunctional cooperation. Elsewhere in the sea, the predators are evolving flair. One develops a flexible membrane and starts engulfing prey with flair. Another grows a tail so long it swims like it's doing laps for Instagram likes. A third begins to secrete enzymes that pre-digest victims from across the water like passive-aggressive acid spit. Their victims, of course, respond by getting thicker cell walls, or producing slime barriers, or simply duplicating so fast that death becomes a rounding error. It's not balance, it's biochemical escalation. For every new predatory tactic, there's an equally stupid defensive adaptation. Nature, once again, is just stress with better branding. Meanwhile, the microbial mats along coastlines have transformed from casual slime to biochemical fortresses. They trap sediment. They alter pH. They absorb light so efficiently that anything trying to photosynthesize underneath gets denied like a loan application with bad credit. These mats are not passive environments. They're toxic, competitive, and utterly indifferent to your survival. You don't grow on them, you join them. And if you're not photogenic enough, you get buried in silt and turned into a fossil. That's the circle of life here. Grow, layer, die, harden. Above it all, the atmosphere keeps shifting. There's now enough oxygen that the sky, once a hazy stew of volcanic gases, is starting to tint the faintest shade of blue. Not that anyone can see it. No eyes yet, no heads, no concept of color. But chemically speaking, the planet is starting to clean up. Rain still falls acidic. Thunderstorms still drop lightning into the ocean like cosmic tasers. But now every flash of electricity lands in water already teeming with life. And every strike is a chance for someone to mutate, explode, or accidentally become interesting. On land, biofilms have crept farther inland, not far, just a few centimeters past the splash zone. But it's enough to leave pigment behind, enough to trap dust, enough to build the very first whispers of what could generously be called proto-soil. These aren't plants, not even close. They're more like sticky grime that refuses to admit it's dying, but they hang on. Some form crusts, dark, crunchy surfaces that trap moisture and cling to rocks with the determination of burnt cheese on a pan. Others burrow into pores in the rock itself, hiding from UV radiation and pretending they're the first homeowners on Earth. They dry out, they flake off, they blow away in the wind. But a few return. A few survive. And those few start altering the landscape in invisible ways. Chemical weathering accelerates, minerals change, surfaces begin to corrode in different patterns. Rocks that once ignored biology now start to wear down because of it. Not dramatically, not fast, just enough for geology to start taking notes. Meanwhile, the shallow seas become increasingly structured. There are now stratified communities of microbes, light lovers at the top, oxygen haters at the bottom, freeloaders in the middle, everyone jostling for position like passive-aggressive commuters in a single-lane roundabout. Some eukaryotes invent cysts, tiny armored forms that allow them to hibernate during hard times. Others develop flexible membranes that allow them to squeeze through crevices or wrap around prey like gooey murder balloons. And a few begin sharing genes. That's right. Horizontal gene transfer is now a party trick, cells swapping bits of DNA like gossip, acquiring new functions in hours instead of generations. Need a resistance enzyme? Steal it. Want to photosynthesize? Borrow the code. Want to detoxify oxygen? Steal from someone who already gave up and figured it out. This is biology without rules, innovation by theft. Evolution by remix. And so the oceans churn on, increasingly crowded, increasingly structured, and increasingly full of cells that no longer accept being mediocre. We now inch into the chemically awkward era of roughly 3.33 billion years ago, give or take a poorly timed volcanic burp. At this point, the biosphere isn't just alive, it's busy. Every layer of ocean, every mineral crack, every puddle of briny despair is now colonized by something slimy, spiteful, and metabolically overconfident. Let's talk about those oceans again. Remember when they were just hot tubs of doom? Now they're fully stratified metropolises. The photic zone is a mess of light-hungry freeloaders. Below that, a bustling smog of oxygen metabolizers battling for chemical dominance. At the bottom, Anaerobes and extremists clinging to their outdated sulfur-based lifestyle like conspiracy theorists in a bunker. Between those layers, life gets weird. Chemical gradients emerge, temperature shifts, light fades, nutrients fluctuate. Every inch is a war zone where the weapon of choice is molecular adaptation. Some microbes now specialize in interface zones. They hover at boundaries, where oxygen meets sulfur or light meets dark, leveraging instability the way an opportunist exploits a nervous system glitch. These edge dwellers thrive on contrast. They don't pick a side. They pick both and metabolize like traitorous diplomats. Back at the surface, cyanobacteria continue to act like the planet owes them royalties. They haven't changed in hundreds of millions of years because they don't need to. Why improve when you're already terraforming the planet without permission? They remain the top-tier oxygen farts of the biosphere. Every second, they blast more O2 into the ocean, choking anaerobes, rusting metals, and slowly oxidizing the crust. They're the original climate influencers, ruining everything by just existing. But they're not alone anymore. Photosynthetic eukaryotes are spreading, slowly, lazily, like algae with a trust fund. They've got chloroplasts now, courtesy of kidnapped cyanobacteria, and they use them to generate sugar, replicate, and act superior. They're larger, more complex, and wildly inefficient, but in low-pressure environments with good lighting, they dominate. A few even develop flotation structures, little gas vacuoles or lipid bubbles that keep them near the surface like smug, microscopic balloons. They don't dive, they don't hunt, they just bask. And honestly, it works. Elsewhere, evolution continues to stumble forward like a drunk toddler with a hacksaw. Some cells develop rudimentary secretion systems, not to communicate, to poison. They deploy enzymes that dissolve neighbors. They excrete repellents. They drop chemical mines into the environment and wait for the screaming to stop. It's petty, it's gross, it's incredibly effective. In response, other cells grow thicker membranes, or detox pathways, or just abandon the upper layers entirely and sink to places no one else wants to live. The early real estate war of life is not fought with teeth or claws. It's fought with pH levels, gradients, and toxic oozes. Multicellular behavior continues to evolve in the dumbest possible way, through accidents that work too well to undo. Some eukaryotic colonies now exhibit consistent structure, not just blobs, organized blobs, outer layers that protect, inner layers that grow. Cells that specialize so hard they lose the ability to divide. These aren't just flukes anymore. They're trends. And for the first time, colonies are surviving generational splits. They divide not into single cells, but into new colonies. This is multicellularity in all but name. The only thing missing is a body plan and a marketing department. Meanwhile, out on land, the microbial invasion trudges forward. Cyanobacteria are forming crusts on exposed rock. Thin, crackly biofilms held together by stubbornness and protein glue. They live through rainstorms. They survive dry spells. They trap dust. They start weathering the rock itself, turning it, over the course of forever, into something that might one day be called soil. They're not building anything, they're just not leaving. Occasionally, a patch survives long enough to become a proper microhabitat. A wet corner, a protected crack, a slightly shaded patch of crust where cells divide in peace for an entire afternoon before dying horribly. This is Earth's first land ecosystem, a stain. Back in the sea, predation is scaling up. Some eukaryotes are now purpose-built predators. Big, relatively, fast, comparatively. equipped with all the tools of a serial absorber, flagella for movement, sensors for detection, and a mouth-like groove for swallowing smaller cells whole. These are the apex predators of the Precambrian. And yes, they're still invisible to the naked eye, but for everyone else, they're nightmare fuel with organelles. Prey, in turn, get smarter. Some grow hard shells, others hide in mats. A few develop escape reflexes, simple twitch responses to chemical cues or pressure changes. Not nerves, not thought, just flinching. But that flinch might be the difference between survival and becoming someone else's ATP. The ocean is now structured not just by light and chemistry, but by fear. And so we slide, reluctantly, into the tail end of the 3.3 billion year mark. At this point, Earth isn't just alive, it's accidentally building systems. Chemical cycles are entangled, microbial populations are layered like lasagna, and the biosphere is dangerously close to making sense. Let's start with the big news. Oxygen is winning. It's no longer a trace gas. It's no longer just some weird cyanobacterial side effect. It's a full-blown planetary crisis for anyone who remembers the good old days of anoxic tranquility. The oceans are oxidizing, slowly, reluctantly, layer by layer. And now, with most of the dissolved iron rusted out of the water and buried in seafloor sediments, there's nothing left for oxygen to react with, so it lingers. It builds. It begins leaking into the air in amounts too large to ignore and too small to breathe. The atmosphere is officially different. Still mostly carbon dioxide and nitrogen, sure. Still hot, still vaguely murderous, but now it's flavored with just enough oxygen to start reacting with sunlight in new ways. Enter ozone. For the first time, there's a thin, patchy layer of ozone in the upper atmosphere. It's weak, it's unstable, but it's just strong enough to start absorbing ultraviolet radiation. And that somehow changes everything. Because for the first time, shallow waters aren't bathed in full cosmic death beams. Sunlight still penetrates, but it doesn't sterilize. Biofilms near the surface get a reprieve, photosynthetic cells drift higher, and a few brave microbes begin experimenting with barely being on land. Rocks near the shoreline are now dotted with dark stains, patches of microbial crusts that survive for hours instead of minutes. They grow, they photosynthesize, they dry out, they die, they do it again. And somehow, these microbial suicides begin to add up. Each wave brings a little salt. Each rainstorm deposits a few minerals. Each death leaves behind organic residue. And over millions of years, these crusts start to alter the land itself. It's not soil, not really, more like bioactive grime, but it's sticky, structured, and vaguely productive. In the oceans, eukaryotes are getting louder. Not literally, they still don't have mouths or lungs or the concept of performance, but they are now everywhere. They float, they swim, they crawl along surfaces with coordinated flagella like single-celled vacuum cleaners from a dystopian Pixar short. Some have full photosynthetic kits, nucleus, mitochondria, chloroplasts, a smug attitude. Others are predators, equipped with ingestion grooves and enzymes potent enough to liquefy a mat. And then there are the hybrids, mixotrophs, cells that photosynthesize during the day and hunt by night like confused algae with commitment issues. They're inefficient, they're weird, they're doing great. Multicellularity continues its slow-motion car crash into inevitability. Some eukaryotic colonies have now stabilized into repeatable patterns. Cells divide, specialize, and remain attached like a microscopic startup with no HR department. There's internal structure, there's labor division, there's group survival. Some cells stop reproducing entirely to support others, becoming the first martyrs in the name of collective function. It's not a body, but it's close. And now, for the first time, there's visible complexity in the water. Still tiny, still boring, but big enough to notice if you squint, have a microscope and several billion years of hindsight. Elsewhere, the chemical cycles are becoming unrecognizable. Nitrogen is fixed, recycled, stolen, and reused in dizzying loops. Sulfur moves through oxidation states like it's trying on outfits. Carbon gets bound, freed, burned, buried, and reabsorbed faster than geology can track. And behind it all, oxygen, the passive-aggressive architect of biochemical hell. It alters everything: membranes, metabolisms, minerals, even the rules of survival. Organisms that adapt to oxygen get 30 times more energy from the same amount of food. That's not a marginal improvement. That's biochemical steroids, and with it comes explosion of growth, complexity, and evolutionary nonsense. Cells start building internal transport systems, tiny protein channels, ion pumps, vesicles. It's all still wet nonsense, but now it has infrastructure. And in these increasingly complex cells, mistakes start to happen: genetic errors, misdirected divisions, new structures that serve no clear purpose. Until they do, some of those errors become organelles, some of those mistakes become systems, and some of those disasters become the foundation of everything else. We now enter the twilight of this stretch of Shmearth's history, still 3.3 billion years ago, still absolutely allergic to progress, but undeniably inching towards something vaguely impressive. Let's get one thing straight. Nobody asked for complexity. It's expensive, it's error-prone, it's annoying. And yet life keeps tumbling face first into it like a drunk sprinting down an escalator. Take gene regulation. Some microbes now express different genes based on environmental signals. Not all the time, not well, but enough to say, stop producing photosynthesis proteins when they're in the dark, or switch to fermentation when oxygen gets scarce. This is rudimentary logic, the biology equivalent of flipping a switch with a wet noodle. But it means cells can adapt on the fly. It means responses can be dynamic. It means the age of the one-trick microbe is ending, and what happens when you allow living things to optimize? They start causing problems. Let's talk ecosystems. By now we have entire microbial networks that function as tightly coupled resource cycles. One cell's waste is another cell's lunch. Sulfate reducers, methanogens, nitrifiers, denitrifiers. Everyone passing molecules around like a chain-smoking hippie commune with access to grant funding. In some layers of the ocean, these micro-ecosystems get so tight they function like tissues. One group fixes nitrogen, one group handles sulfur, one group removes oxygen just so the others don't die. It's not cooperation, it's chemical codependence, and it's terrifyingly efficient. Meanwhile, mixotrophy is the new black. Why just photosynthesize when you can also eat your neighbors? Why only metabolize sugar when you can also ferment sulfur if the mood strikes? Why pick one strategy when you can be a biochemical mess that does everything badly but never dies? This approach, jack of all trades, master of none, starts to dominate in transitional environments, shorelines, sediment interfaces, cloudy water, places where specialization means death by Tuesday. Back on land, things are still crusty. The cyanobacteria are now forming permanent microbial mats on every damp surface they can ooze onto. They glue themselves to rocks. They trap particles. They build up layers of dead cells like sedimentary spite. Over time, these mats start to alter the surface albedo of the land. Dark mats absorb more sunlight. That heat slightly changes evaporation. That evaporation affects rainfall. That rainfall changes where microbes can live. And just like that, we're starting to see the first whispers of life modifying weather. Barely, stupidly, accidentally, but still. Meanwhile, in the oceans, we get the first glimpses of cellular predation escalation. Some eukaryotes now form pseudopodia, temporary arm-like extensions used to crawl across surfaces and engulf prey. It's not movement in the traditional sense, more like creeping death in a jelly bean-shaped trench coat. Others develop digestive compartments, internal vacuoles that isolate prey, fill with enzymes, and break things down like a stomach that hasn't been invented yet. It's not digestion, it's entrapment with extra steps. And some eukaryotes evolve the ability to recognize prey, not consciously, not visually, just chemically. They drift toward certain molecules. They linger near specific pH gradients. It's the earliest form of targeting, and once it exists, it spreads like gossip in a poorly ventilated break room. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the spectrum, some cells go full pacifist. They grow thick, spiky shells. They absorb minerals like calcium or silica and construct little armor suits. These are the first signs of mineralized exteriors, not for movement, not for eating, just for not getting murdered. It's a simple arms race, digest versus defend. Some evolve chemical repellents. Others develop coordinated movement patterns to avoid being tracked. A few form swarms, moving as a group, changing direction based on shared chemical signals. None of it is conscious, but it works. And so the ocean becomes a theater of biological escalation. A silent war of cell types and chemical cues, of engulfers and evaders, of photosynthesizers who refuse to adapt, and predators who refuse to stop growing. It's no longer just life happening in water, it's strategy happening in slime. And in this mess, error becomes innovation. A duplicated gene becomes a new protein. A misfolded membrane becomes an organelle. A failed division becomes a permanent colony. And each time it works, even a little, it becomes something that evolution refuses to throw away. This is no longer survival of the fittest. It's survival of the least incompetent. And somehow, against all odds, it's working. We now arrive, finally, reluctantly, at the closing stretch of this 200 million year microbial fever dream. It's still 3.3 billion years ago, barely. But Earth has spent the last 200 million years mutating itself into something almost respectable. Almost. The oceans are now functionally partitioned, not by fences, not by rules, but by gradients: light, oxygen, temperature, salinity, nutrient availability. Every microbe knows its lane, chemically speaking. You don't see sulfate reducers drifting into oxygen-rich zones. You don't see light huggers floating near the vents. You stay where you belong or you die. That's the rule. The shallows are now biodiversity hotspots. They're messy, layered, stratified zones of desperation. Microbial mats stretch like scummy continents. Stromatolites rise like biological zits. Towers of dead cells, sediment, and blind determination. And drifting between them all, eukaryotes. Oh yes, the eukaryotes have gone from novelty to nuisance. They're everywhere now, floating, crawling, engulfing, photosynthesizing, occasionally doing all four at once, badly. They've refined their internal structure. Mitochondria are now standard issue. Chloroplasts, if you can afford them. A cytoskeleton? Absolutely. These cells don't just wobble, they move. directed, deliberate, and occasionally predatory. And now some of them are growing big. Not big in the dinosaur sense, not even in the jellyfish sense, but big for a cell. Large enough to engulf smaller eukaryotes, large enough to host entire microbial ecosystems on their surface, large enough to become problems. This shift toward complexity, size, and structure comes with trade-offs. Big cells are slow, vulnerable, energy-hungry, but they compensate with strategy. Some develop defensive spikes, others produce chemical camouflage, enzymes that break down toxins before they reach the membrane. A few start storing nutrients in vacuoles, hoarding molecules, planning ahead, or at least pretending to. And so the oceans are no longer just zones of floating goo. They are now landscapes of organized chaos. Let's review. At the surface, sun-guzzling photosnobs turning the ocean into an oxygenated mess. Below them, aerobic microbes burning sugar like they've discovered caffeine. Below that, fermentation junkies living on leftovers and sulking in the shadows. At the bottom, sulfur eaters clinging to vents and pretending they're still relevant. Above all this, an atmosphere that has finally accepted it's going to have oxygen, whether it wants to or not. There's now enough O2 in the air to alter mineral chemistry on land. Iron-rich rocks begin to turn red. Clay minerals form with different hydration states. Even weathering patterns begin to change. The Earth is oxidizing, and it's not stopping. Rain is still acidic, but now it's got oxidized compounds in it. That means rust. That means soil precursors. That means chemical landscapes are no longer purely volcanic. They're biologically modified. The land is not alive, but it's not untouched. In shaded crevices and damp spots, biofilms are forming permanent stains. These aren't just temporary visitors, these are residents. Some even survive for days, a few for weeks. They divide, they die. They leave behind pigments, organics, and sometimes, just sometimes, enough muck to trap dust and form the beginnings of structure. Meanwhile, back in the ocean, something strange is happening in the eukaryotic world. Some colonies don't break apart. They divide. They stay together, they repeat, and then something new, differentiation by design. One group of cells becomes the outer layer, defensive, rigid, dead if needed. Another group becomes the nutrient processors, absorbing food, circulating resources. And the innermost layer, reproductive, immortal, the chosen ones. This, friends, is not a colony. This is organizational intent. This is proto-body structure. This is multicellularity. Still microscopic, still silent, still stupid, but undeniably different. And with it comes the earliest whispers of a terrifying possibility: purpose. Biological systems begin showing traits they can't yet justify. Anticipation, redundancy, resilience, the kinds of traits that make extinction slightly less inevitable. Of course, most of them still die. They get eaten, dissolved, outcompeted, but not all. And the survivors carry with them mutations that favor not just survival, but structure. Elsewhere, in shallower seas, some eukaryotic lineages go full plant mode. They form flat colonies, broad surface areas, slow growth, passive nutrient uptake. They don't move, they don't eat, they just exist, powered by light and spite. They're terrible at everything, except surviving. And that's the theme now. Survival no longer means just not dying, it means outlasting, out-adapting, out-replicating. Life is no longer just present. It is persistent. This concludes episode 3. Earth is now 3.3 billion years old. It has a biologically altered atmosphere, stratified oceans teeming with phototrophs, predators, and microbial landlords. The first coordinated multicellular structures, land surfaces beginning to stain with life, and a future that's starting to look less like an accident and more like a setup. You can smell evolution on the air, and it smells like algae, rot, and the slow, creeping arrival of something worse.